The airport security checkpoint was humming with the usual chaos of travelers rushing to catch their flights. But what happened next would stop everyone in their tracks and expose a truth nobody was prepared to face. When Captain Rebecca Morgan, a decorated military officer with over 15 years of service to her country, stepped forward in civilian clothes to present her credentials, the TSA officer didn't see a hero, didn't see rank, didn't see sacrifice. He saw only one thing. And what he did next would gin the entire airport to its core. Because standing right behind her, watching everything unfold in disguise, was someone whose reaction would change everything. But first, you need to understand how we got here. Because this story isn't just about one moment of discrimination. It's about a system, a culture, and a reckoning that was 15 years in the making. Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, Terminal C. 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in September. Captain Rebecca Morgan had just completed a 6-month deployment overseas, leading a logistics battalion that coordinated humanitarian relief efforts across 3 war-torn regions, saving thousands of lives, earning commendations from generals and foreign dignitaries alike. And now she was finally coming home, but not in uniform this time because she'd been traveling for 36 hours straight and just wanted to blend in. To feel like a regular person for once, to grab a coffee and catch her connecting flight to visit her mother in Atlanta, who was recovering from surgery and hadn't seen her daughter's face in person for half a year. Rebecca had chosen to fly civilian, dressed in jeans, a simple blazer, and her natural hair styled and beautiful. Locks that framed her brown skin and tired but hopeful eyes. She carried only a small carry-on bag and her military ID along, with her captain's credentials tucked safely in her wallet. What Rebecca didn't know was that her decision to dress down would trigger a chain of events that would expose the ugly truth about profiling in America's airports. And standing 3 people behind her in line wearing a baseball cap, sunglasses, and an unremarkable gray hoodie was Captain James Mitchell, a white officer from her same battalion, someone who had served under her command and respected her deeply. But today he wasn't here by coincidence. He was here undercover, part of a military investigation into discrimination complaints filed by service members of color at major transportation hubs. And what he was about to witness would make his blood boil, and his report would later become evidence in a federal case. Rebecca approached the TSA checkpoint with her boarding pass and ID ready, offering a polite smile to the officer manning the document. Verification station, his name tag read D. Harrison, a middle-aged white man with thinning hair and the kind of permanent scowl that suggested he'd long ago stopped seeing travelers as human beings and started seeing them as inconveniences. ID and boarding pass, he barked without looking up, and Rebecca complied immediately. Sliding her military ID across the counter along with her documentation, but instead of the usual quick scan and wave-through, Harrison's eyes narrowed as he picked up her ID, held it up to the light, turned it over multiple times, then looked at Rebecca with undisguised suspicion. "This yours?" he asked, his tone dripping with accusation. And Rebecca, confused but still patient, responded, "Yes, sir, that's my military identification. I'm Captain Rebecca Morgan, United States Army." Harrison scoffed, then called over his shoulder, "Hey, Martinez, come look at this," summoning his supervisor. A shorter man with a clipboard who rushed over with an annoyed expression, and now 2 TSA agents were examining Rebecca's perfectly legitimate credentials as if they'd just discovered a counterfeiting operation. And you could feel the energy in the line shift as other travelers began to notice, some craning their necks to see what the holdup was, others checking their watches impatiently, and Rebecca felt heat rising in her chest. That familiar mixture of humiliation and rage that black professionals know all too well, the feeling of being presumed guilty, presumed fraudulent, presumed less than despite every credential, every achievement, every sacrifice. "Ma'am, we're going to need to verify this," Martinez announced loud enough for half the terminal to hear, as if Rebecca was some kind of criminal, and when she calmly asked what exactly needed verification, since military IDs are among the most secure forms of identification in existence, Harrison cut her off. "We have protocols, and right now you're holding up this entire line. So if you could just step aside and wait while we make some calls." But Rebecca stood her ground. her voice steady but firm. "I am a captain in the United States Army. I have provided valid government-issued identification. And I have a flight to catch. What is the actual issue here?" That's when the atmosphere really shifted. Because Rebecca's words carried the unmistakable authority of someone who'd commanded soldiers in combat zones, someone who'd stared down actual threats with grace and courage. And suddenly other travelers were paying attention, really paying attention. An elderly black woman, two people behind Rebecca, caught her eye and gave a subtle nod of solidarity, recognition passing between them without words. The shared knowledge of what was really happening here. A young white couple ahead in line pretended not to notice, suddenly very interested in their phones, performing the kind of willful blindness that allows injustice to thrive in plain sight. But three people back, Captain James Mitchell was watching everything through his sunglasses. His jaw clenched so tight he could feel his teeth grinding, his hand instinctively pulling out his phone to document what was unfolding. Because this was exactly the kind of incident the investigation was designed to expose. A qualified, decorated military officer being publicly humiliated and subjected to excessive scrutiny for no reason other than the color of her skin and the texture of her hair. Martinez was now on his radio calling for additional support, using codes that suggested a situation, and Harrison had physically stepped between Rebecca and the security checkpoint as if she posed some kind of threat, and you could see it in his body language. The way he'd puffed up his chest, the way his hand rested near his radio, the way he was performing authority for an audience, asserting dominance over someone he perceived as powerless, someone he'd already decided didn't belong in the category of respected military officer because his biases wouldn't allow him to see past her blackness. Rebecca remained calm outwardly, but inside she was calculating, processing, deciding how to navigate this minefield because she knew God. Did she know that any display of anger, any raised voice, any attitude would be weaponized against her, would become justification for escalation, would transform her from victim to threat in the narrative these officers were already constructing in their minds? But then Harrison made a mistake, the kind of mistake that arrogant people always make when they believe they're untouchable. He started talking, and the more he talked, the more his true colors showed like ink bleeding through wet paper. "Look, lady, I don't know where you got that ID, but military officers don't exactly look like—" He trailed off, catching himself before saying the quiet part loud. But everyone heard it anyway, heard it in the pause. In the once-over his eyes gave Rebecca's locks, her civilian clothes, her brown skin, and Martinez, sensing his colleague was about to create a legal liability, tried to interject with, "What Officer Harrison means is that we need to follow enhanced verification protocols for certain—" But Harrison, feeling emboldened by his own perceived authority and perhaps resentful at being interrupted, actually interrupted his own supervisor. "No, what I mean is we get fake IDs all the time. And I'm not just going to wave someone through because they claim to be something they're probably not. Regulations are regulations." The irony was almost poetic. Here was a man with minimal training, minimal education, minimal authority, questioning the credentials of a woman who'd spent nearly 2 decades serving her country, who'd earned her rank through excellence and sacrifice, who'd passed security clearances that Harrison couldn't even comprehend, and his arrogance was about to cost him everything. Rebecca took a deep breath, and when she spoke again, her voice carried that dangerous calm that every soldier recognizes, the calm before strategic action. "So let me understand this correctly. You're detaining me, a United States Army captain with valid military identification and boarding pass, at a security checkpoint, preventing me from catching my flight, based on what specific regulation or reasonable suspicion?" Harrison's face flushed red. "I don't need to explain myself to you. Now step aside before I call airport police and have you removed for creating a disturbance." And that's when Captain James Mitchell decided he'd seen enough. Because what Harrison didn't know, what Martinez didn't know, what nobody in that terminal knew except Rebecca herself, was that she wasn't alone, wasn't without backup, wasn't the isolated target they'd assumed she was. Mitchell removed his sunglasses, pulled off his baseball cap revealing his military short haircut, and stepped forward through the line, with the kind of purposeful stride that makes people instinctively move aside. And when he reached the checkpoint, he didn't ask permission, didn't wait for acknowledgement. He simply placed his military ID on the counter next to Rebecca's and said in a voice that carried command authority, "I'm Captain James Mitchell, United States Army, and I'm here to inform you that you are currently detaining my superior officer without cause, that this entire interaction has been documented as part of an official military investigation into discrimination at this facility, and that you have approximately 10 seconds to explain to me why a decorated combat veteran is being treated like a criminal, while I, with identical credentials but different skin color, was waved through this same checkpoint 20 minutes ago without a single question." The silence that followed was deafening. You could actually hear the ambient noise of the terminal fade as nearby travelers stopped mid-conversation to watch, and Harrison's face went from red to pale to a sickly gray as the implications hit him like a freight train, and Martinez started stammering something about misunderstanding and protocols, but Mitchell cut him off. "No, what this is textbook racial profiling, and it's been recorded, time-stamped, and will be included in a federal report, along with footage from airport security cameras that I'm certain will show a very interesting pattern of who gets extra scrutiny at this checkpoint and who doesn't." Within minutes, the checkpoint had transformed from a space of humiliation into a scene of accountability. A TSA supervisor from the main office arrived practically running, followed by an airport police lieutenant who took one look at the two military IDs, one look at the officers involved, and immediately understood the magnitude of what had just occurred. Harrison tried to defend himself. "I was just following protocol. I didn't know." But the supervisor shut him down instantly. "You were given valid military identification, and you chose to question it. Detain the officer and threaten her with arrest. There is no protocol that supports that action." Martinez attempted to distance himself from his colleague's behavior, claiming he was just called over and didn't make the initial stop, performing the classic dance of self-preservation that people do when they realize the ship is sinking and they're looking for lifeboats. But Rebecca, standing tall now with Mitchell beside her and vindication settling over her shoulders like the uniform she'd earned the right to wear, wasn't interested in their excuses. She was interested in change, in accountability, in making sure no other service member would face what she'd just endured. "I want a formal complaint filed, I want written documentation of this incident, and I want assurance that this checkpoint's practices will be reviewed," she stated clearly. No anger in her voice now, just the crystalline clarity of someone who'd found their power again after it had been momentarily stripped away. The TSA supervisor nodded vigorously, already pulling out forms, already calculating how to minimize liability, already throwing Harrison under the bureaucratic bus to protect the agency, because that's how these systems work. They protect themselves first. And justice for individuals comes only when it's convenient or unavoidable, Mitchell added. And you should know that this is incident number 47 in our investigation across 12 major airports, and Captain Morgan's experience is going into a report that will reach congressional committees by next month. Harrison, realizing his career had just imploded in spectacular fashion, tried one last time to salvage something. "I didn't mean anything by it. I was just doing my job." But Rebecca turned to face him directly for the first time since Mitchell's arrival and said something that would echo in that terminal long after she'd caught her flight. "Your job is to keep travelers safe, not to humiliate them, not to profile them, not to assume they're criminals based on how they look. And the fact that you can't see the difference is exactly why you shouldn't have this job." Rebecca Morgan caught her flight that morning, 3 hours delayed but ultimately victorious. And when she finally embraced her mother in Atlanta, she carried with her not just the exhaustion of a long deployment and a discriminatory encounter, but also the satisfaction of knowing she'd stood her ground and sparked change. Within 3 weeks, TSA implemented mandatory anti-bias training at DFW Airport. Harrison was terminated following an internal review that revealed a pattern of complaints against him that had been ignored for years. And Rebecca and Mitchell's report contributed to broader policy reforms regarding how military personnel are processed at security checkpoints nationwide. But here's what really matters. What really cuts to the heart of this story and stories like it that happen every single day across America. Rebecca Morgan had credentials, had rank, had witnesses, had an ally who could validate her truth. And she still almost didn't get justice. She still had to fight for basic dignity, still had to prove her worth, still had to navigate a system designed to presume her guilt instead of her humanity. So imagine, just imagine for a moment, how many people face similar discrimination without the credentials to defend themselves, without the witnesses to validate their experience, without the allies to step forward when it matters most, without the happy ending that makes the story worth telling. That's the real story here, not just Rebecca's victory, but the countless defeats that happen in silence, in shadows, in moments when nobody's recording and nobody with power is watching and nobody steps forward to say, "This is wrong." The question isn't whether discrimination exists in our airports, our workplaces, our communities. The evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. The question is what we do about it. Whether we perform blindness like that couple on their phones, or whether we find the courage to be like Captain Mitchell, to step forward when it's uncomfortable, to use whatever privilege or platform we have to amplify voices that are being silenced, to transform witnessing into action. This is Axiom USA, where we tell the stories that matter, the uncomfortable truths that need to be heard, the moments of injustice and the fights for justice that define who we are as a society. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you that dignity isn't something people should have to fight for, but something we all deserve simply by being human, then hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe because we're not stopping until every story of injustice becomes a catalyst for change, until every Rebecca Morgan knows they don't have to fight alone, until the Harrisons of the world understand that bias has consequences and humanity has advocates. One story, one truth, one moment of courage at a time.